Tokyo, 1989, 2:30 a.m. A nondescript warehouse in Yokohama's industrial district. Three men in expensive suits watch as a container is unloaded. Inside aren't drugs, aren't weapons, aren't counterfeit goods. Inside are 47 Nissan Skyline GT-Rs, fresh from the factory, VINs filed off, headed for destinations that will never appear on any official export document. The man in charge isn't a car dealer. His business card says logistics consultant. But the full-body tattoos hidden under his tailored suit tell a different story. He's a lieutenant in the Yamaguchi Gumi, Japan's largest Yakuza syndicate. And this warehouse? It's one of dozens processing stolen and gray market vehicles worth hundreds of millions annually. This wasn't a one-time operation. This was standard business. And the cars flowing through this warehouse would end up everywhere. Australia, New Zealand, United States, Middle East, Russia. Anywhere there was demand for Japanese performance cars that manufacturers couldn't or wouldn't officially export. But vehicle theft was just the visible tip. The real money, the real control, ran much deeper. Into the tuning shops, the parts suppliers, the racing teams, even the magazines that documented the scene. The Yakuza didn't just participate in Japan's automotive underground. They owned it, controlled it, profited from every level of it. This is the story nobody wants to tell. How organized crime infiltrated, manipulated, and ultimately controlled significant portions of Japan's tuning industry during its golden era. The legitimate shops that took dirty money to survive. The racing teams funded by criminal enterprises. The parts supply chains run by Yakuza-affiliated companies. And the uncomfortable truth that some of the most famous builds, the most legendary shops, the most celebrated parts of JDM history have Yakuza fingerprints all over them. Because when you follow the money in 1990s Japanese tuning culture, the trail leads somewhere dark. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's get into it. To understand how the Yakuza infiltrated tuning culture, you need to understand how Yakuza business works. The Yakuza aren't street gangs. They're sophisticated criminal enterprises operating with business structures, legitimate fronts, and deep political connections. The three major syndicates, Yamaguchi Gumi, Sumiyoshi Kai, and Inagawa Kai, collectively control an estimated $200 billion in annual revenue. That money doesn't come from dramatic heists or drug deals like Western movies suggest. It comes from controlling entire industries: construction, real estate, entertainment, waste management, and in the 1980s and 90s, automotive modification. The strategy is always the same. Identify an industry with high cash flow, minimal regulation, and cultural stigma that keeps legitimate banks away. Offer capital that legal sources won't provide. Slowly take ownership through debt, equity stakes, or outright intimidation. Turn the industry into a money laundering operation while extracting profits. Japanese tuning culture in the late 80s fit this profile perfectly. Cash-heavy businesses, minimal paper trails, banks reluctant to lend to street racing associated shops, young entrepreneurs desperate for capital to expand, customers paying cash for parts and services. To the Yakuza, it was perfect, and they moved in systematically. The infiltration started with vehicle acquisition, legal and otherwise. In 1988, Nissan released the R32 Skyline GT-R. Demand exploded instantly. Production couldn't keep up. Dealership waiting lists stretched 18 months. The gray market went insane, with cars selling for 50% over MSRP. The Yakuza saw opportunity. They had connections at ports, in shipping companies, at dealerships. Cars could be redirected from their intended destinations. Paperwork could be altered. VINs could be changed. A GT-R bought legally for 4.5 million yen could be sold gray market for 7 million yen, pure profit with minimal risk. But this required infrastructure, warehouses to store vehicles, mechanics to modify VINs and paperwork, transport networks to move cars, front companies to launder the sales. By 1990, an estimated 15 to 20% of gray market GT-Rs flowing to export markets had Yakuza involvement somewhere in the chain. Former Tokyo Metropolitan Police Detective Tanaka Hiroshi, who worked organized crime in the 90s, explained it in a 2018 interview. The Yakuza treated high-performance cars like commodities. Stolen, redirected from legal sale, didn't matter. If someone wanted an R32 GT-R in Australia and would pay cash, the Yakuza could make it happen. The margins were massive, and enforcement was nearly impossible because the cars crossed multiple jurisdictions. One specific operation, broken up in 1994, revealed the scale. Police raided a warehouse in Yokohama, Yamaguchi Gumi affiliated, and found 73 vehicles: Skylines, Supras, RX-7s, NSXS. Total value, 380 million yen, roughly $3.5 million at the time. Documents showed this was just one distribution point in a network spanning 8 cities. But stealing and redirecting cars was just the entry point. The real money was in the modifications. Tuning shops in late 80s. Japan faced a critical problem: capital. Building a 600 horsepower Supra required expensive parts. Upgraded turbos ran 800,000 yen. Forged internals, another 600,000 yen. Standalone ECU, 400,000 yen. For a small shop doing maybe 5 builds a month, that's 9 million yen in parts inventory, roughly 85,000 US dollars, just to keep operations running. Traditional banks wouldn't lend to street racing shops. Too risky, too culturally problematic, too associated with illegal activity. So, how did dozens of tuning shops expand rapidly in the late 80s and early 90s despite no access to legitimate capital? The answer was Sarakin and alternative lending, much of it Yakuza controlled. Sarakin are private lending companies, legal but predatory, charging interest rates up to 29.2% annually, the legal maximum in Japan at the time. Many Sarakin companies were Yakuza-owned or affiliated, using them to launder money while extracting obscene interest from desperate borrowers. A tuning shop owner, speaking anonymously to automotive journalist Smokey Nagata in a 2015 interview, described how it worked. "I needed 5 million yen to buy a dyno and expand my shop. No bank would touch me. A business consultant approached me at Tokyo Auto Salon. Very polite, very professional, said he could arrange financing. Interest rate was high, maybe 25%, but I was desperate. I signed the papers without reading carefully. The terms were brutal. If payments were late, penalty interest added 10% monthly. If the shop defaulted, collateral wasn't just equipment. It was the business itself. The borrower became an employee in their own shop, with Yakuza-affiliated management extracting profits. How many shops fell into this trap? Impossible to know precisely. Police estimates from the mid-90s suggested 15 to 20% of tuning shops in Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya had some level of Yakuza financial entanglement, not necessarily by choice, often by necessity and desperation. And once you took their money, you followed their rules. But direct lending wasn't the Yakuza's only entry point. They controlled supply chains. Performance parts in the 1990s. Japan came from several sources. Legitimate manufacturers like HKS, Trust, Greddy. Smaller specialists like Mines, Top Secret, RE Amemiya, and a vast gray market of unbranded, replica, and counterfeit parts flooding in from China, Taiwan, and Thailand. Guess who controlled the gray market import channels? Yakuza-affiliated trading companies. These weren't obviously criminal operations. They had proper business registrations, offices in industrial districts, professional-looking websites. But investigation by Japanese customs in 1996 revealed extensive Yakuza connections throughout the import supply chain. The math was simple. A legitimate HKS turbo kit cost 450,000 yen. A gray market replica, visually identical, but with questionable materials and quality control, cost 180,000 yen. For a budget-conscious customer or struggling tuning shop, the choice was obvious. The Yakuza didn't just import and distribute these parts. They manufactured some of them. Police raids in the late 90s discovered factories in China producing counterfeit parts with Yakuza investment, fake Greddy intercoolers, replica Trust turbos, counterfeit Nismo, parts with convincing packaging. The contamination was extensive. Even shops trying to stay legitimate struggled to verify parts' authenticity. A 2001 investigation by Option magazine tested parts from 30 tuning shops. 42% had at least some counterfeit or gray market components. Many shop owners claimed they didn't know, and some genuinely didn't. But others absolutely knew and accepted it because the margins were better. Former parts supplier Yamamoto Kenji explained in a 2019 interview, "The Yakuza didn't force us to buy their parts. They just made them available. Cheaper, faster delivery, better payment terms, and if you refused, suddenly your legitimate suppliers had delays and inventory problems. You either played along or you struggled to compete." This created a perverse incentive structure. Shops using legitimate parts had higher costs and lower margins. Shops using Yakuza-supplied gray market parts could undercut them. Customers couldn't tell the difference until something failed, and by then, the money was spent. If you're shocked by how deep this goes, hit that subscribe button, because the racing teams and magazine involvement is even darker. Japanese racing in the 90s had a dirty secret. Many teams were Yakuza-funded, not factory teams. Toyota, Nissan, Honda ran clean operations with corporate budgets and proper oversight. But the private teams, the privateer entries in Super GT, D1 Grand Prix, Time Attack, many had questionable funding sources. Racing is expensive. A competitive Super GT campaign could cost 200 million yen annually, roughly $1.8 million. Sponsorships helped, but weren't enough. Where did the rest come from? A former team manager speaking anonymously to Speed Hunters in 2017 broke it down. "Our primary sponsor was a real estate development company. Very successful, very generous. Never asked for much visibility, just wanted their name on the car. I didn't question it. Then one day, police showed up asking about the company's ownership structure. Turned out our sponsor was a front for Sumiyoshi Kai. We'd been laundering Yakuza money through racing for 3 years without realizing it." This wasn't an isolated case. A 2003 investigation by Japanese authorities identified at least 12 racing teams with direct or indirect Yakuza financial connections between 1995 and 2002. Some were money laundering operations. Others were legitimate teams that took dirty money because clean money wasn't available. The Yakuza benefited multiple ways: money laundering through team expenses, parts purchases, and prize winnings; prestige and cultural legitimacy by association with successful racing; and networking opportunities with wealthy enthusiasts who might be useful for other business ventures. But the darkest aspect was betting and race fixing. Japanese law prohibits gambling on motorsports, but underground betting on races existed, Yakuza run, with massive money changing hands. And if you own the team or have financial leverage over drivers, you can influence outcomes. Did this happen? Provably yes. In 2001, 3 drivers were banned from D1 Grand Prix after investigation revealed they'd intentionally underperformed in qualifying to manipulate betting odds. The betting operation traced back to Inagawa Kai. The drivers claimed they were threatened and coerced, not willing participants. How widespread was race fixing? Unknown. Most drivers who were approached stayed silent out of fear. Those who refused found themselves blacklisted, unable to secure rides, mysteriously unable to get parts or technical support. The Yakuza's control wasn't absolute, but it was sufficient to cast doubt over entire seasons of results. And that doubt poisoned the legitimacy of Japanese motorsport in ways that still linger. Then there were the magazines, the documentary record of JDM culture, and some of them were compromised too. Automotive magazines in 1990s, Japan were cultural powerhouses: Option, Hyper Rev and Carboy, G-Works. They shaped trends, made shops famous, influenced what thousands of enthusiasts built. Advertising in these magazines could make a tuning shop's reputation. Negative coverage could destroy one. The Yakuza understood this power, and they exploited it. Some magazines took money directly, not from Yakuza presenting as Yakuza, but from marketing consultants and advertising agencies that were actually Yakuza fronts. A full-page ad might cost 500,000 yen officially, but a Yakuza-connected shop could get preferred placement, positive coverage, and favorable editorial for 2 million yen under the table. Former magazine editor Suzuki Takeshi, speaking in a 2016 podcast after retiring, admitted, "We knew some of our advertisers had questionable backgrounds, but magazines operate on thin margins. If we refused their money, we couldn't publish. And they never asked us to write anything explicitly false, just emphasize certain shops, feature certain builds, ignore certain problems. This created a distorted record. Shops with Yakuza backing got disproportionate coverage, appearing more successful and influential than reality justified. Clean shops struggled for recognition. Readers making decisions based on magazine content didn't know they were being manipulated. The deepest compromise came with event coverage. Big automotive events, Tokyo Auto Salon, Osaka Auto Messe, required security and logistics support. Many events contracted with event management companies that were Yakuza fronts. This gave them access, control over vendor placement, influence over which shops got premium booth locations. A 2002 investigation by Japanese business magazine Nikkei Trendy revealed that 5 major automotive events between 1998 and 2001 used security and logistics companies with documented Yakuza connections. The events claimed they didn't know. The Yakuza companies operated under legitimate business registrations and provided professional services, but the money flow was undeniable. By the late 1990s, Yakuza involvement in tuning culture was so extensive that legitimate business became nearly impossible without some level of compromise. You needed parts? Gray market suppliers with Yakuza connections offered better prices and terms. You needed capital? Sarakeen lenders, many Yakuza affiliated, were the only option. You wanted racing sponsorship? Companies with questionable backgrounds wrote the checks. You needed positive magazine coverage? Advertising deals with intermediaries who had connections. At every level, every decision point, the Yakuza-connected option was easier, cheaper, more accessible than the legitimate path. And incrementally, shop by shop, the industry became compromised. Not every shop, not every part, not every team, but enough. Sufficient that the Yakuza's economic fingerprints were on a substantial portion of JDM culture's golden era. Former Tokyo prosecutor Watanabe Koji, who specialized in organized crime cases in the 90s, summarized it in a 2018 interview. The Yakuza didn't control tuning culture through force. They controlled it through capital. They were the only ones willing to fund an industry that banks considered too risky. And in exchange for that capital, they extracted profits, laundered money, and gained cultural influence. By 2000, you couldn't participate in Japanese tuning culture at a serious level without touching Yakuza money somewhere in the chain. The crackdown came in the early 2000s as part of broader anti-Yakuza legislation. Japan's economy had crashed. The Yakuza's traditional revenue sources, construction and real estate, had collapsed with the bubble. They'd become more aggressive, more visible, more brazen. Public tolerance evaporated. In 1992, Japan passed the Act for Prevention of Unjust Acts by organized crime group members, commonly called the Anti-Boryokuden Law. It wasn't immediately effective. But amendments throughout the 90s gave police broader powers to investigate Yakuza business operations and freeze assets. The automotive angle came in 2001, with amendments specifically targeting money laundering through small businesses. Banks and financial institutions were required to report suspicious transactions. Front companies faced increased scrutiny. The regulations made it much harder to move dirty money through tuning shops and racing teams. Major operations were shut down. In 2002, police raided 14 locations in Tokyo and Osaka, seizing vehicles, parts inventory, and financial records from tuning shops with proven Yakuza connections. Total seizures, 4.2 billion yen in assets, roughly $35 million. But the real impact was reputational. Shops identified as Yakuza-connected, even indirectly, faced customer boycotts. Sponsorships evaporated, magazine coverage disappeared, the cultural association with organized crime became toxic. Some shops closed, others rebranded, brought in new management, demonstrated clean operations. The legitimate shops that had struggled for years suddenly found themselves competitive because the Yakuza-funded operations were gone. By 2005, the Yakuza's visible presence in tuning culture had largely ended. Not because they'd lost interest, but because enforcement and cultural rejection made it unprofitable and risky. But here's the uncomfortable question. How many of the legendary shops, famous builds, and celebrated parts of JDM history have Yakuza connections we'll never know about? That R32 GT-R that set a Tsukuba record in 1999? Where did the 15 million yen budget come from for the build? That tuning shop that exploded from obscurity to prominence in 18 months? Who provided the capital? That racing team that somehow always had the best parts and biggest budget despite modest sponsorship? Who was really writing the checks? We don't know. We'll probably never know. Because the evidence was destroyed, the participants stay silent, and the legitimate fronts remain convincing. Some names circulate quietly among people who were there. Shops that insiders know had Yakuza backing, but were never caught. Builds that involved laundered money. Teams that were funded by criminal enterprises. But naming them publicly invites lawsuits, creates legal liability, and brings unwanted attention from people you don't want noticing you. So the industry collectively agrees to forget, to focus on the cars, the engineering, the performance, to ignore the uncomfortable questions about where the money really came from. Today's Japanese tuning industry is cleaner, mostly. Anti-Yakuza laws are stronger. Financial oversight is tighter. Banks are more willing to lend to legitimate shops. The stigma of street racing has faded, replaced by legal track culture. The Yakuza's influence has retreated to nearly invisible levels. But the legacy remains. The parts supply chains established in the 90s still exist, though ownership has changed. The gray market import channels are still operating, though supposedly under legitimate management now. The relationships and networks built during the Yakuza era didn't disappear, they just went darker. And in some ways, the Yakuza's involvement shaped positive aspects of tuning culture. The availability of capital, even dirty capital, allowed innovation and risk-taking that clean money wouldn't support. The aggressive expansion of parts supply chains, even when those chains included gray market components, made modifications accessible to regular enthusiasts. Without the Yakuza's money, Japanese tuning culture might have been smaller, slower, more conservative, less influential globally. The R32 GT-R might not have become legendary without the Yakuza-facilitated gray market that spread them worldwide. The Supras' reputation might not have exploded without the Yakuza-funded builds pushing performance boundaries. It's a devil's bargain, and the devil got his cut. For Western enthusiasts buying JDM cars and parts, this history raises ethical questions. That gray market R34 you imported in 2024? There's a non-zero chance its path out of Japan in 1999 involved Yakuza-connected export channels. Those vintage JDM parts you bought from a Japanese supplier could be old inventory from Yakuza-supplied gray market operations. Does that matter? Is it ethical to benefit from a supply chain that has criminal origins, even if current operations are clean? Or is it so far removed, so historically distant, that the connection is meaningless? There's no easy answer. But pretending the connection doesn't exist is willful ignorance. Every R32, R33, R34 that left Japan through gray market channels in the 90s, every tuning shop that took Saracen loans to expand, every racing team that accepted sponsorship from Yakuza fronts, every magazine that ran paid content from compromised advertisers, every parts supplier that dealt with gray market importers. All of it together created the JDM culture we celebrate today. The machines, the performance, the innovation, built partially on a foundation of organized crime money. The Yakuza's role in Japanese tuning culture isn't a myth or exaggeration. It's documented fact. Police records, court documents, investigative journalism, former participants willing to speak decades later. The evidence is overwhelming. The Yakuza saw opportunity in automotive modification culture and exploited it systematically throughout the 1990s. They didn't do it dramatically. No shootouts at tuning shops or midnight raids. Just quiet capital investment, supply chain control, and incremental influence. The boring, methodical approach that's always been Yakuza's real strength. And it worked. For over a decade, organized crime elements extracted profits from Japanese tuning culture while simultaneously enabling its explosive growth. They were parasites and fertilizer simultaneously, harmful and beneficial depending on your perspective. Here's what we know for certain. Between 15 to 20% of tuning shops in major Japanese cities had Yakuza financial connections in the 1990s. Gray market vehicle exports, many Yakuza facilitated, moved thousands of GT-Rs, Supras, and RX-7s internationally. Counterfeit and replica parts, often Yakuza supplied, contaminated the aftermarket extensively. Multiple racing teams received Yakuza funding, some knowingly, some not. Magazine coverage was influenced by Yakuza advertising money. Major automotive events used Yakuza-connected security and logistics. And here's what we suspect but can't prove. Some of the most famous builds from the 90s were Yakuza-funded. Certain record-setting time attack runs involved laundered money. Some shops considered legendary had deeper Yakuza connections than ever acknowledged. The rapid global spread of JDM culture was facilitated by Yakuza distribution networks. Some famous barn-find cars in the 2000s were actually Yakuza-owned vehicles being liquidated to avoid asset seizure. The truth is buried, deliberately, by people with strong incentives to keep it buried. This is the JDM Engine Archive. Sometimes the most celebrated aspects of car culture have the darkest origins, and sometimes legends are built on foundations you don't want to examine too closely. The Yakuza's influence on Japanese tuning culture is the story nobody wants to tell because it complicates the narrative. We want to believe JDM culture was pure grassroots passion, enthusiasts pushing boundaries with limited resources and unlimited dedication. And that's partially true. Most participants were genuine enthusiasts. Most shops operated legitimately. Most builds were funded by honest money. The passion was real. The innovation was real. The culture was real. But the money behind it, that was more complicated, dirtier, more entangled with organized crime than anyone wants to admit. When you look at a pristine R32 GT-R, you're not just seeing a legendary car. You're seeing the end result of a complex supply chain where some links involved criminal organizations. When you read about famous 90s builds, some of those budgets came from laundered Yakuza money. When you watch archive footage of racing from that era, some of those teams had dirty funding. Does that diminish the engineering achievement? No. Does it make the cars less impressive? No. Does it mean the culture wasn't meaningful? No. But it does mean the full story is more complex, more morally ambiguous, more uncomfortable than the sanitized version we prefer. Drop a comment with your thoughts. Did you know about Yakuza involvement in JDM culture? Does it change how you view the era? And if you want more uncomfortable truths about automotive history that nobody talks about, smash that subscribe button. Next time, the hidden costs of Japan's economic bubble collapse, and how it killed tuning culture, but created the collector car market that's now pricing out the enthusiasts who built it. Thanks for watching. And remember, follow the money and you'll find truths you didn't want to know.